This is Richie Venton, the Scottish Socialist Party trade union organiser. The Scottish Socialist Party, alongside several trade unions, the umbrella Scottish Trade Union Congress and other anti-racist activists, are busy building for a massive rally and demonstration in George Square on the 7th of September. Now, the purpose is to combat the threat of the far right, to combat their racism, but I think critically also to combat the ongoing and perpetual attempts by those in power to divide and conquer the working class by sowing racist divisions, and also to put forward an alternative to the false solutions that are put forward by the far right towards the working class who sometimes listen to them. In order to do that, I think it's really important to identify who are some of the main actors and inciters of the recent race riots. Because yes, there are fascist groups involved, but frankly they are minuscule at this stage. More of that in a moment. But some of the key actors are not just filthy racists, but filthy rich. And they're people who have absolutely nothing in common with some of the most deprived in society that they're trying to incite into becoming the attack dogs in the race riots, the pogroms against black and brown people that we've witnessed in England, Northern Ireland, and which we need to make sure does not happen in Scotland either. Fascist groups do exist, mostly on the fringe. In Scotland, there's the likes of Active Club Scotland, which conducts outdoor training sessions, physical activities, bare-chested boxing and wrestling, which I don't know whether that's something to do with homoerotic delusions or what, but they in particular have the aim of becoming the vanguard of fascism in Scotland. But they're still small. However, they're trying to recruit on the basis of the recent race riots. There's also groups like the Homeland Party, led by ex-British National Party member Kenny Smith. Of course, they also are very small. They're a split off from the Patriotic Alternative, and there's talk that they've only got one member in Erskine now as a result of anti-fascist activities when they tried to stir up violence and hatred towards asylum seekers in a hotel there. These groups are tiny. But one of the things that's new in society is the fact that they can broadcast their vile propaganda on an unprecedented level through the use of social media. There's been all sorts of locations such as Telegram groups. They call for things like murder of non-whites, for the making of Molotov cocktails to bring to demonstrations. And they are Holocaust deniers. They're anti-Semitic, although recently their emphasis has been on Islamophobia, anti-Muslim, as opposed to anti-Semitic. That's been their biggest emphasis in more recent times. The truth of the matter is that none of those dangerous fascistic forces could gain any traction whatsoever if it hadn't been for the bigger forces that are the greater danger, in my opinion, lurking amongst the rich, the capitalist elite, in politics and in the media. Now, in the case of the media, some of the things that are most significant is the way in which Murdoch established his empire over recent decades. And of course, we see the way in which Fox News, for example, has taken on board the whole theory of the Great Displacement. This nonsense that there's a conspiracy on a world scale to displace white people, white populations, with black and brown people in power in several countries, including this one. That has been absorbed as a theory by the likes of Fox News and also by other figures such as Andrew Neil's Spectator magazine. Those are some of the factors that have led to an atmosphere, a sort of ecosystem in the media, whereby it's possible for racist filth to be spread and appear to be perfectly reasonable, perfectly mainstream. And it's also political figures, of course, who have made these racist tropes more acceptable in the eyes of some sections who have then in turn been incited into race riots. Of course, amongst those, people like David Cameron, who for all his apparent nice liberal sounding image talked at one stage about the country being swarmed. We particularly see that with figures like Suella Braverman, quite recent Tory Home Secretary, who said that her greatest dream was to see a front page of the Telegraph showing the first flight of asylum seekers and refugees to Rwanda. Rwanda being a country which others have reported how Congolese refugees were shot by the regime in that civil war nightmare of a country. And even the right wing of the Labour Party have played into this atmosphere, where they also have whipped up all the talk about immigration, about the problem with the small boats, and so on. They all have a measure of guilt for what more traditionally right-wing, extreme right forces like Farage and Tommy Robinson, so-called, have of course been well identified with. The fact is, this is nothing new in the history of imperialism, including specifically British imperialism. British capitalism has a long and filthy tradition of imperialist arrogance, of a racist contempt for other races and nations, to kind of self-justify the ruthless exploitation they've carried against other nations. And of course, deployment of the very useful, frequently used weapon of divide and rule to quell the demands of working class people, spreading racist lies about the superiority of one race over another to distract attention from the real problems, the real causes of those problems of poverty, inequality, extreme deprivation, which in essence is the way in which capitalism creates those conditions through the amassment of wealth for a tiny handful at the top of society. And if you just skip over a few examples from history, we had the case of Ireland, where, of course, British imperialism conquered its first colony. And to take one aspect of that, they destroyed native industries in Ireland, and then to help to justify their ruthless exploitation of the Irish land and the Irish people, Irish labour, they portrayed Irish people as stupid, as thick, as savages. For instance, in the 19th century, Punch magazine had cartoons of the Irish portrayed as apes. That's an example of how racist propaganda is deployed, number one, to divide people within a working class, and number two, to cast the blame on outsiders, on immigrants, so-called foreigners and so on, instead of casting the blame at the rich. But of course, the interests of the ruling capitalist class changes from time to time, and they change their position accordingly. It's naked cash calculation for that. For instance, in the period after the Second World War, we had the creation of the National Health Service, a huge reform, a huge gain for the people of Britain, under pressure from a radicalised population demanding change after the experience of the Second War. But one of the things that created was a shortage of staff for the health service. And therefore we got in 1948 the appeal for people to come from places like the Caribbean, what became known as the Windrush generation, who came to work in the health service as nurses and auxiliary staff and so on in our hospitals. That was then. And even in the period of 1960 to 1963, the Tories by then were back in power, and Enoch Powell was the health minister. And the same Enoch Powell headed up a campaign to recruit from Commonwealth countries, including the Caribbean, into the National Health Service at a time when there was something like 50,000 vacancies in the health service. That was them in the early 60s. But by 1968, there was the beginnings of some change in society, which led to Powell doing a complete somersault. 1968 saw the first indications and hints of crisis in international capitalism. But also in response to that, a huge revolt amongst the population, a younger generation especially, typified by France 68 with generous strike action and so on. And in that context, where the capitalists began to worry about their own prospects, they began to worry they couldn't keep control of their own native working class populations, some of them began to deploy the age-old weapon of racist divide and rule. And that's when Enoch Powell came out with his infamous April 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, where he argued that immigration into Britain would end up in those who came into the country, black and brown people, being involved in rivers of blood, in civil war in the country, and so on. And of course, then skipping forward a few years, we saw the period of this Labour government of 1974 to 79, which was put into office with great expectation of change after the Tories were defeated by the miners' strike. And when the Labour government bowed the knee to international capitalism, to the International Monetary Fund and other forces like it, and began to carry out savage cuts, in reality the first example of monetarism, of neoliberalism in a sense, then when that happened, it disappointed millions of people in Britain. And into that cauldron of discontent and disillusionment stepped not just forces on the left, but forces on the fascist right, such as the National Front, and then later on the British National Party. Now, those were openly declared and openly organised Nazi organisations that denied Holocaust, that denied that there was such a thing as the Holocaust, openly anti-Semitic, but also viciously racist in general, including towards black people, and they tried to carry out campaigns of terror and only defeated when anti-fascist forces, including trade unionists, marched on the streets and drove them off the streets. And I think that many of today's figures who are inciting the race riots are actually the dregs and offshoots of those openly, avowedly fascist groups like the National Front and the BNP. And one of the things they definitely have in common with each other is that they're filthy rich. I'll just mention two of those key figures who've been at the heart of inciting the violence, and then, of course, after it's been carried out, and there's a backlash against it, and unity rallies against racism, they tried to distance themselves slightly verbally from the violence which their words had unleashed. And those two figures I'm going to mention are Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who hides under the name of Tommy Robinson, and Nigel Farage. Now, Yaxley Lennon is a direct link with that period I've mentioned of the fascist groups such as the BNP, because he started out as a football hooligan with Luton Town, ended up being a member of the British National Party. And of course, the British National Party for a period managed to get people elected, including to the European Parliament, Nick Griffin and Andrew Bruns. And they used the wealth that accrued in order to perpetrate their fascist propaganda. Now, up to date, although he's not any longer in such a group, Tommy Robinson, or Yaxley Lennon, is extremely rich, filthy rich. One estimate is that he has access to wealth of £3 million. More conservative estimates is somewhere between £1 and £2 million, and a good amount of that has been accrued through repeated appeals for donations from amongst some of the poorest in society, some of the poorest whites who fall for his racist propaganda, his Islamophobic propaganda. And then the other figure I'll mention is Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage, some of his schoolmates have revealed the fact that when he was at school, which wasn't any ordinary school, it was Dulwich College, which was a public school in London, which up to date charges £55,000 a year for boarders at that public school. But when he was at that school, he was notorious amongst friends and teachers for being a fascist. He was described as a fascist by some of his teachers. He was described by school pals as a fascist. He was apparently obsessed with his own initials, NF, equating with National Front, the fascist group. He was also known for singing Nazi songs, including ones that started out with the lines, gas them all, referencing the death camps for the Jews and others. And he then went on to be a businessman of sorts. He dodged tax. He, for example, resigned his chair of a company owned with his brother after they'd been discovered to be dodging tax to the tune of £100,000 by the Inland Revenue. Farage Limited in 2022, I think it was, where he resigned after that discovery. And that tax debt, it was never paid, by the way. He makes a fortune out of things like videos that he makes on a regular basis, usually at least 4 a day, charging £75 a time. He gets at least over £100,000 on a stint on GB News. It's estimated that he also is a property millionaire, where he owns one house in Bromley worth at least £600,000 and has recently bought another one last year worth £500,000 in the seaside resort of Lyddon-on-Sea in Kent. He's a property millionaire, and some estimates put his total wealth at £3.2 million. So here we have this character parading around as if he was some kind of beer-swilling, cigar-smoking lad, one of the boys, one of the people. And yet he's actually a filthy rich racist who stores up division within the working class for his own self-aggrandizement, his own wealth. But also he plays a very useful role for a section of the ruling class, the capitalists of Britain. Because at least initially what he did was to say things that were regarded as unspeakable, something would damage the careers of Tories if they openly said it, but he was allowed to act as a kind of a foil for them and their real views, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11, because 9/11 was a turning point. Don't forget that horrible atrocity carried out by fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, who had been trained and armed by the CIA in Afghanistan, amongst other things, that when that atrocity of 9/11 was carried out, then George W. Bush, with Tony Blair hanging on his coattails, declared what they called the War on Terror. And the War on Terror, as well as the invasion of Iraq on completely bogus grounds, the lie, the big lie about weapons of mass destruction, as well as that, it was accompanied by a systematic campaign of Islamophobia, of blaming all Muslims for the actions of a tiny, tiny handful of Islamic terrorists who actually had been created, had been radicalised, and in some cases directly funded by Western governments for their own ends previously. So they created the problem, the Western capitalists, imperialism. They created the problem of tiny groups of Islamic terrorism. And then in response to the murders of 9/11, they launched a crusade to blame all Muslim people in particular. Hence the whole phase of Islamophobia, of lying about the fact that they were coming in to take over the country. They were taking all our jobs, taking all our houses, and part of the great displacement theory of the white race being displaced at home by invaders through immigration. And I think that those who rally against the racists on the 7th of September and at localised demonstrations need to also remember there's an old trick of capitalism, of imperialism, to divide the working class in order to defeat us, to rob our wages by robbing our belief in solidarity and unity, to distract us from the real enemy, which is the rich elite, including some of these figures who are inciting this propaganda. Because, for example, when they say that Muslims coming into the country in particular, but immigration in general, then they're not talking about all immigrants. They're not talking about all forms of people coming into the country. They're talking about black and brown people. It's openly, nakedly racist. One simple point. When Emmanuel Macron was seeking election as president of France, he visited London as part of an election campaign. Why? Because London is the 6th biggest city of French people anywhere. So it's not French immigrants into Britain that they're condemning and pointing the finger at. It's black and brown people, because they're more easily identified, they're more easily blamed. It's easier to incite ill-informed poor people to attack them than it is to point out the fact there's the rich who are robbing the working class regardless of colour creed, or country of birth. And so when they, for example, say that the health service has been wrecked by the burden of immigration, they need to be reminded that there's a huge dependency on health staff from abroad to keep the health service going. Not just in the days when Enoch Powell was advertising for people from the likes of the Caribbean, but today where there's a massive problem of vacancies in the National Health Service because of the levels of demoralisation, of burnout, also the lack of investment, the lack of training, the lack of staff being made ready for replacement of those who are reaching retirement age and so on. And we have a position where right now something like 1 in 5 of National Health Service England staff were born outside of Britain. They were born in 200 different nationalities, according to surveys that have been conducted. Roughly 265,000 of 1.5 million health staff in England are people who were born outside the United Kingdom. Roughly 35% of doctors come from outside Britain and 28% of nurses. So the health service would collapse without people from abroad, including black and brown people. And that one simple fact is a reminder why we cannot allow these filthy rich race inciters to get away with dividing the working class, because it's a dirty lie they base their propaganda on. And therefore it's just as important to remember that we have to have unity of the working class as it is to campaign against the racist attacks on black and brown people. Of course, we need to mobilise the power of an organised and united working class to stop physically, where necessary, the attacks, the arson attacks, the murder attempts on ethnic minorities. But we also have to mobilise masses of people against the attempts to divide the working class, a very simple but profound point. And that means that on the 7th of September and other events, we need to preach against racism, against racist division within the workers' movement and in the working class as a whole, but also put forward alternatives that help to cut the feet from under the racist liemongers like Tommy Robinson, like Farage, and like the more mainstream politicians, including Tory and Labour leaders that I've mentioned before. We need to put forward a programme that says invest in the health service, expand the health service, don't destroy it through privatisation like Labour is planning. Invest in education, invest in smaller class sizes and more teachers, instead of blaming immigration for pressures in the health service or in the education system. Invest in the building of 100,000 council houses for affordable rent in Scotland, instead of peddling the big lie that immigration causes a shortage of housing. The fact is, immigrants make a net contribution to the economy. Recent reports have confirmed that. Umpteen reports over the years from University College London and various other authoritative bodies have proven the point repeatedly. And another recent report last week has confirmed that the net impact on the economy is positive, that people who come into this country contribute far more to the overall economy than they take back in terms of services. So unite against racist attack, unite against racist divisions within the working class, and equally and simultaneously unite for measures that will use the wealth of society for working class people of all colour, creed and country of birth, regardless, and show up and expose and destroy the arguments of the filthy rich, filthy racists who have been inciting race riots and trying to divide the workers' movement in order to make themselves even richer in the process.